be talking about Strymon Riverside Boss OD2R with some heavy mods on it. We're going to talk about the Strymon DIG dual delay, Line 6 M9, and we are going to talk about what they sound like and how I ended up going from all that and eventually ditching it all and ending up on this 100%. Pedals. Guitar players, we love them. It's a huge part of how we get our sound, how we make songs our own, and kind of put a signature on what we do. Pedal boards are constantly changing for me, and I am going to run through the pedal board that I used at the beginning of the Fracture album and also the process of how it changed throughout the record and how I ended up selling a bunch of it and ended up getting on the Pod Go. That's another thing we're going to talk about. And we'll play some examples from the record as well as kind of a bonus to isolate some of those tracks and give you guys an idea of what some of these pedals sound like. So this is a part ordinarily where I would be holding up these pedals, talking about them, how cool they are. But the reality is I went from a pretty big pedal board running through a tube amp, my PV Classic 50, and by the end of the record was doing everything direct. So overdrives and distortions, we are going to start by looking at the board, and we are going to talk about the Strymon Riverside. This is a very cool pedal. Strymon does amazing things with delays and reverbs, as everybody knows, but I really think this is one of the most underrated pedals in their entire lineup. I was looking for a Swiss Army knife of distortion and overdrive, and I found it in this. It's a fantastic pedal. You can get sounds ranging from full-on Marshall tube heads to sounds that are a little more reminiscent of like a Rat, Proco Rat, which it does very well. It's been my go-to overdrive and sort of heavier distortion for a long time. I've also got a couple other Joyo pedals on this board as well. One of them mainly is the Joyo Uzi. Very cool pedal, really cheap. I ended up getting it, I think, on Facebook Marketplace locally from somebody used for like 30 bucks, and I couldn't pass it up. I've heard a lot of people refer to this pedal as a clone of the Friedman BEOD. It may be based on the circuit, but I think it kind of does its own thing. And it's somewhere mixing between a Marshall and a Mesa sound. And I was able to get some excellent heavy distortion sounds out of this pedal. I really like it, especially for lead tones, which I use near the end of Nightstands, specifically on the album. And I'll play some of that track a little bit later here too, so you can hear what those sounds are like. One of the other pedals that got a lot of use for me on this album is the Boss OD2R. So this was a pedal that came out in the 80s. They reissued it very briefly in the beginning, like the early 90s. And I was able to find one based on the recommendation of a buddy of mine named Terry Palmer. Terry's an amazing musician and amazing guitar player, but he also does some cool modifications to pedals. A somewhat typical Boss overdrive. This one has a second circuit in it. And with the remote switch, which I have on the board as the little Saturn Works single switch, you can switch between those two overdrive types. The failure with the original production is that you're stuck at virtually the same gain on both sort of two different flavors of overdrive. Terry, however, modded it and put a pot in there with a knob that you can change that second gain structure, and it is awesome. I mean, it completely turned the whole thing into a new beast. It gives a very cool kind of edge of breakup just pushed over, not distortion by any means, but and it doesn't really sound like amp distortion either. Kind of visiting all the overdrive and distortion section of this board is this black pedal, which is spray painted black, all murdered out because the original color of it is a really awful metallic orange. And what the pedal is, it's another Joyo pedal. It's called the American Sound. And it is basically their version of the Tech 21 Blonde, which is designed to sort of model the different characters of various Fender amps. And I'm a huge Fender amp fan. I absolutely love the way their cleans sound, and I love the way they sound when you push them to where the amp is almost blowing up and you're really pushing the tubes hard. Fender amps do something very cool when they're pushed out of their comfort zone, and this pedal does a great job of kind of giving you all of those flavors. And this pedal is essentially an always on pedal for me when I had this board and I was running it. Putting it at the end of my signal chain, it allowed me to run this as if it were a preamp with a cab simulator built into it. It's definitely worth checking out and highly underrated. Probably my favorite section of this board is the delays. I am a delay junkie. It has always been my favorite effect, and usually on my pedal board builds I never have any less than 3 usually at a time. But the first one we're going to talk about is the Strymon DIG. This is a dual digital delay, and it's designed to kind of emulate some very pristine digital delays that came out in the 80s. And it's got an awesome modulation that you can dial in that gets very trippy and very cool. And one of the things that I like to do is you can set it so the regeneration of your delays is actually giving you sort of a high pass filter that gets more and more intense as those delays keep cycling out. And you can hear that at the intro of Nightstands. One of my other things I really loved about this Strymon pedal, the DIG, is if you hold down the bypass button, it will freeze your delay and keep cycling it back to you. And it's basically like a hold and repeat function, which you can hear click in at the beginning intro of Nightstands, and I utilize that feature. But back to the Digitech Expression Factory. This is an amazing pedal, and I don't know why it didn't sell better and why it didn't get more acclaim than it did. The whole reason why I got it is because I really was looking for one effect out of it and one effect only. Digitech put out a ridiculous line of pedals called the XP pedals, probably about mid-90s, and I had one called the Space Station. And this thing did absolutely nothing other than make out-of-this-world spaceship noises. But it did have some of the most amazing swell, volume swell effects. And I haven't been able to find anything that does a volume swell quite the way that Space Station pedal does. But this thing gets pretty close. It's a really cool pedal, and that's how I got a lot of the swell effects, using that with the Strymon DIG. And taking up a lot of real estate on this particular pedal board build is the Line 6 M9. It's basically a multi-effects processor. I mostly used this for when I was looking for just really standard delays that I could count on. The tap tempo is great in it, and I liked that you could synchronize the delay and the tremolos together since it was one signal path, and the tap tempo on the pedal is like a global tap, so you get really cool synchronized effects from this as well. So probably one of the biggest major changes I experienced when I was tracking guitars on this record was I was really looking for more of a consistent tone. There is always something that happens when you're recording, especially putting a mic on a tube amp. I've always struggled with the fact that it always felt like the last time I plugged in and the next time that I would plug in, everything would kind of sound different. You know, as you know, if you've ever mic'd a cab, even a half inch of either away from the speaker cone or to the left or right can make a dramatic difference in the tone you're getting when you're recording guitars. So I ended up experimenting with the Line 6 Pod Go. And when I got this, I had the full expectation that if it did everything that I was understanding it promised, I would most likely end up taking the dive and getting into a full Helix floor, I figured probably within a year. And it definitely did not let me down. It was a great stepping stone to get into Helix. The sound of Pod Go is featured probably best on the album for the guitar work in Under the Umbrella. So, in the ever-changing landscape of pedal boards, buying stuff, selling stuff, changing my sound around, that's just a little bit of the kind of the journey I made going through this Fracture record. Thanks for sticking around and checking this out. The next video I'm going to be working on is talking a little bit more about the Helix, specifically Line 6 Helix, and that'll be the next video, so I hope you guys will check that out as well, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.